This is Ledburn Court, a 39-metre, 13-floor, 60s tower block in Moss Side, Manchester. The end of the offshore pirate radio days forced radio renegades inland, and like many other tower blocks up and down the country, they made the ideal location for this new breed of land-based pirates. Along with this came the threat of GPO, DTI, and later Ofcom raids. It was part and parcel of every pirate station's life. This block became home to a pirate radio station, and so naturally it saw numerous raids. A young DJ, who I won't name, made his way to the studio here in Ledburn Court to do his evening slot at a pirate station called WBLS, or White and Black Liaison Station, on a cold November evening in 1988, when the station suddenly went off the air. He didn't have a mobile phone, and so he stopped at a phone box to call the on-air DJ John Paul, who ran the station. Fearing WBLS had been raided, the DJ wanted to make sure before he turned up and ran into some DTI men. John Paul didn't pick up the phone. The inspectors had indeed planned to storm the flat WBLS was operating from. They claimed the station was putting lives at risk by interfering with British Gas's radio frequencies. In the process of what should have been a normal raid, something terrible happened. A DTI inspector had suddenly dropped dead. His name was Roy Threlfall, and he was only 37. As he and a colleague were climbing the dozen flights of stairs to reach WBLS, he collapsed. The DJ arrived at Ledburn Court and noticed some unusual black cars that didn't belong there, and it was then he saw a group of men bringing a collapsed man out into the entrance. Policemen on the raid with the Department of Trade and Industry officers tried to revive Roy Threlfall, as another officer ran to a Moss Side police station for first aid equipment. Sadly, he died on the scene. While it was perhaps the most tragic, WBLS was no stranger to government raids over the years. In fact, pirate radio stations in Manchester and the surrounding areas were subject to many busts during the land-based heyday. Our journey continues with a tiny pirate radio station that launched itself against a big pirate operation in the same town. Southside Radio, broadcasting from somewhere around here in a rented porter cabin at Mellor, was a mosquito bite to the larger KFM pirate radio station, or at least that's what a Stockport magistrate said back in May 1985. Funnily enough, he described KFM as a mosquito bite on the legal independent station Piccadilly Radio. Southside's owner Paul Yarwood, then aged 24 and living in Marple, and a DJ Patrick Peets, then aged 28 from Shore Heath in Stockport, began broadcasting under the name Small Town Radio. They'd been transmitting only 2 months before they were raided by the DTI in November 1984. The Home Office investigators had been monitoring the station and wanted to shut it down. It was housed in a porter cabin at Moor End Road in Mellor. When the DTI men knocked on the door, Patrick Peets was inside with headphones on, broadcasting music, and he was asked to fade out his transmission, which I thought was quite a friendly thing for them to ask him to do. Nevertheless, all of the equipment was seized. Paul Yarwood owned all the technical equipment, and the DTI successfully applied for it to be forfeited. He claimed it cost £3,500, which was a considerable sum in those days. This case came just weeks after KFM were prosecuted. I'll point out here that this video is quite long, so I won't cover the raids of KFM, Radio Aquarius and Buzz FM, but I will leave links to the full documentaries I've made in the description below. Southside never made any money out of the station and ceased transmissions from Mellor when they were raided. Peets, who had been unpaid and was working there for experience, was fined £200. Yarwood was fined £500 and both were ordered to pay £30 in costs. After the Southside Radio and KFM raids, it appeared that the DTI men remained in the area, as just a month later, Southside was in hot water again. Although not operating as a pirate station as such, a DJ who claimed he worked for nothing for Southside Radio was caught red-handed playing records on illegal equipment. Magistrates at Stockport heard that Philip England, stage name Philip Charles, was broadcasting from Cobden's Club in Stockport when the DTI investigators arrived. Philip admitted using an illegal radio transmitter and was fined £115 with £85 costs. Again, the equipment seized in the raid was confiscated. He wasn't transmitting from the club to the local area, he was actually sending his DJ output up to Hare and Hounds Farm here on Wornath Low, using a UHF link. From here, it was being rebroadcast on the FM band to the wider area. Investigators had traced the signal to the unmanned station, which picked up the UHF link from the club in Stockport. Warrants were obtained from magistrates in Stockport and Hyde, and the Stockport warrant was executed first up on Hare and Hounds Farm. The link transmitter was monitored, tracked, and the DTI men swooped on Cobden's club. Manchester's first and at that time only black community radio station was hit in November 1987. ICR, which operated from various addresses in Hume and Moss Side, had equipment worth more than £6,000 confiscated when police and DTI officials carried out a dawn swoop on a house 100 yards from Moss Side police station. Moss Side and Hume have been completely redeveloped over the last half-century, with most of Hume seeing major redevelopments from the early 1990s onwards. Most of the original tower blocks and flats, pubs and precincts don't exist now, but some still remain, although freshly clad, hiding their brutalist concrete innards. 2 DJs who were on the air at the time of the ICR raid were interviewed by DTI men. The radio station hit the air on April 2, 1987, and broadcast to a mainly inner-city audience, but reached as far as Glossop and Bury on 103.5 FM. 2 weeks before the raid, the station began broadcasting 7 days a week and almost 24 hours a day. ICR was soon back on the air, but in March 1988, the DTI men arrived in Moss Side again, flanked by police officers, and used sledgehammers to break into the station once again. This station was becoming important in the community. It helped police investigate the still unsolved murder of a Manchester woman. Detectives were seeking the killer of Elsa Hanaway, a 37-year-old who was savagely beaten to death and raped on October 30th, 1987. She was abandoned in Whitworth Park in Rusholme, leaving behind 5 children and a grandson. Recognising that ICR reached a massive Afro-Caribbean audience, the DTI had turned a blind eye to broadcasting laws for a few months and let the station appeal to listeners for information. ICR also made appeals after another unsolved murder of Tony Gardner on the 9th of January 1988. He was shot at point-blank range with a sawn-off shotgun as he sat in a car on Gretney Walk in Moss Side. He was 26. His murder was eventually solved, but Elsa Hanaway's killer got away. WBLS was also raided around the same time ICR was. Expensive equipment was confiscated in both swoops. This was before the raid in November 1988, in which Roy Threlfall would die. There were 2 presenters on the air when ICR was raided, but the door was broken down while they were shouting to ask them to wait a minute so they could get the key to let them in. At WBLS, there was nobody in the temporary studio of the 16th floor of a block of flats, this time Medlock Court, when the door was smashed in. ICR changed its name to Laser at the end of April 1988. However, they couldn't catch a break, and changing the station's name to Laser didn't help. The DTI men visited again at 8:15 in the morning on the 11th of August 1988. They seized transmitter equipment, record players and tape decks in the station's 5th raid since it was set up. Paul Williams, aged 31, a trainee priest and one of the station's founders, said, "It's the only station which caters for black people, and we hope by persisting we can force the government to press ahead with legislation to legalise community radio." Paul aimed to set up a second radio station called Fresh FM. A station called Superfresh launched in around 1990, but there was no Fresh FM until 2000, when a station of the same name was heard on 100.7. The DTI men swooped on the little-known Stockport-based pirate radio station Radio Fab FM in August 1988, taking a transmitter, tape decks and other equipment worth £2,000. This came only days after the raid on Paul Williams and Laser. Susie Mitchell, the station DJ, pleaded for her confiscated equipment to be returned as she used the station to raise money for charity. She said, "They can keep the transmitter, I realise we shouldn't have used it, and I'm willing to take the consequences, but unless I get back the record decks and tape decks, a lot of innocent people will suffer. We use that equipment to raise money at charity gigs." I'm prepared to give the Board of Trade a written guarantee that we won't broadcast again, even though I am aware that they're considering prosecution and we may have to go to court. But my 12-year-old son is heartbroken and won't eat because they took away his ghetto blaster. They were very heavy-handed, brushing people aside. A spokesperson for the Department of Trade and Industry said no undue force was used. Our investigators were invited into the premises and shown where the equipment was kept. In October 1988, Laser were trying to get their station back on the air after suffering their third raid in 3 weeks. The DTI officers confiscated nearly £1,000 worth of equipment on October the 25th. Just a few days before the raid, Sam Brown confirmed they were also broken into by what was believed to be rival operators. March 1990 saw a different pirate taken off the air when investigators tracked down schoolboy Lee Evans in Heald Green as he operated his bedroom station Hardcore FM. The 17-year-old built his own transmitter for £200 and was playing music within a 10-mile radius of his parents' home in Crantock Drive, Heald Green. He apologised in court and promised never to transmit again, but was given a 1-year conditional discharge and fined £25. Radio Outlook, a religious station, appeared on 96.3 in 1988. According to their announcements, they were broadcasting from the Irish Republic using a 25 kilowatt transmitter. However, their signal coverage said otherwise, and it was clear that the transmitter was in Macclesfield. A Holmes Chapel address was given out on the air at one point, and they had a sister station broadcasting on 96.8 to the neighbouring Stoke area. 2 men appeared in the dock in Macclesfield in May 1990 after a 10-month investigation by the DTI over the summer of 1989. The DTI became suspicious when a religious organisation approached them saying it had been canvassed by Radio Outlook, who were touting for business. The DTI men monitored the air and located Radio Outlook in Macclesfield during its regular Sunday evening broadcast. Investigators set up surveillance in May 1989 and caught 2 men erecting an aerial and transmitter. When approached, the 2 men, Jeff Cooper and Alistair Bates, were evasive, with Cooper denying all knowledge of the equipment. His car was searched and a large amount of Radio Outlook literature was found in the boot. The transmitting equipment was then seized. After the raid, the DTI continued to monitor the air, and on Sunday the 2nd of July 1989, Radio Outlook was back on the air. When investigators closed in, they found Bates with a large aerial. On the same day, Cooper's house was raided, revealing a vast amount of documentation concerning Radio Outlook. The court heard that from the material, it was clear that Cooper was the program controller. Jeff Cooper was a self-employed producer and journalist who claimed he was the brains behind the operation, which broadcast religious material on behalf of organisations like the Billy Graham Organisation and World Vision for Christ from the Macclesfield area. In an office next to a recording studio used for legitimate business, investigators found maps with the station's broadcast areas in Manchester and Birmingham marked on them, as well as 8 separate files from religious organisations, including Billy Graham in America. Investigators also seized a typewriter ribbon which, when analysed, showed that about £3,000 worth of work had been obtained from the USA in March 1990. Bates and a third member of the outfit, David Townley, both denied making any money from the station and said they'd only been attracted by the excitement of pirate radio. Cooper admitted running the station after being approached by the Pan American Broadcasting Company. He said he only got 15% of the earnings and the money was long spent. He admitted using wireless telegraphy apparatus without a license, contrary to the Wireless Telegraphy Act of 1949, installing such apparatus and aiding and abetting, counselling and procuring co-defendant Alistair Bates. Cooper was fined £150 for each of the first 2 charges and £300 for the other, with £100 costs. He denied a further charge of using, and this was withdrawn. Bates admitted 1 charge of using without a licence and was fined £200 with £100 costs, and David Townley pleaded guilty on 2 charges of using and 1 of installing, and was fined £400 with £100 costs. Radio Outlook disappeared from 96.3 and was never heard around Macclesfield again. IBC, short for the Illegal Broadcasting Company, was transmitting from a top-floor council flat in Armadale Court on Haywood's Darnhill Estate when it was raided in May 1991. The DTI had received complaints that the station was beaming music across Greater Manchester on an emergency channel used by the gas board. This was likely a spurious harmonic or poor filtering at a gas board transmitter site. The signal was traced to Armadale Court, but it disappeared as they got closer. Investigating officer Stephen Culling arrived at the block and saw an aerial coming out of a window in a top-floor flat, and shortly after that, transmissions started again. The investigators obtained a search warrant and found the flat crammed with equipment being used by the radio station. The tenant, Paul Horrocks, aged 22, was found guilty after denying illegally using radio equipment. Horrocks said, "It wasn't my fault. I was sticking up for the lad whose stuff it was. He kept coming up to change the tapes. I was cleaning in the front room. I wasn't using it." Paul was fined £250 and the magistrates refused an application to grant £200 costs, but ordered that the equipment which had been seized should be destroyed. After the case, IBC DJ Steve King said, "We're already back in business and will be on the airwaves again this weekend. We play the music that other stations won't. This is the 5th time we've been raided in 4.5 years, but they need to catch us in the act again to prove it." He added, "Paul had nothing to do with the station. It was just unfortunate that he got caught, but we'll pay the fine for him. We're pleased that we don't have to pay the government any costs. They've already turned our application for a licence down." Unity Radio of Moss Side was hit in October 1991 and £1,500 worth of equipment was seized. They vowed to be back on the air by Christmas by launching a fundraising campaign to buy replacement equipment. Station DJ Prince Tony said, "We play the music the community wants and will not be silenced. We'll be back by public demand as soon as we have enough money for new equipment." Unity claimed 750,000 listeners within a 70-mile radius of Moss Side, and had been broadcasting from numerous flats in Moss Side and Hume during the weekends over 1991. A DJ known as The General was caught red-handed playing records on Frontline FM in a DTI raid in February 1995 that marked the start of a tough year for Manchester's Pirates. Investigators tracked down Frontline Radio in Hume after residents complained about interference to their TV and radio sets, a likely story. The General, real name Ronnie Warfall, was prosecuted and admitted in court to using an unlicensed transmitter and participating in the station's management. He was conditionally discharged but ordered to pay £100 in costs. May 1995 saw a piece of DTI propaganda hit the local newspapers. In one clipping I managed to save, veteran pirate hunter Gordon Yates announced that the Radio Communications Agency would seize transmitters and hold DJs, backers and advertisers before the courts. Those named were Soul Nation on 104.6, Frontline on 101.5, as well as Sting, Love Energy, Carousel, Unity, Eastern Radio, Supreme, SFM and Vision FM. Needless to say, it wasn't an empty threat, and Soul Nation, Sting and Frontline at least were all raided during 1995. Soul Nation and Sting were hit in December 1995. The DTI and police officers simultaneously targeted 4 addresses and made forced entries. 2 of the addresses were studios. Soul Nation's was close to Piccadilly in the town centre, and Sting's was at a house in Moss Side. The others were remote transmitters on tower blocks in Hume, which could reach most of Manchester and beyond. 4 people were interviewed, and Gordon Yates, the infamous regional manager for the Radio Communications Agency, who I've covered in detail in my stories on KFM and Radio Aquarius, reiterated his warnings to other stations in the area. His officers tracked down the main transmitters for both stations, as well as the link transmitters, which relayed the signals from the studios. They were granted search warrants by magistrates in Manchester and seized transmitting equipment, as well as record and tape decks, CD players, and collections of CDs, tapes and records. Soul Nation had at this time been broadcasting soul music for about 3 years on 104.6 FM, and as one of the best established pirates, had attracted a considerable amount of advertising. Sting on 103.6 was a newer station, broadcasting soul and reggae. With that, 1995 drew to a close. It was a tough year for Manchester's Pirates, and 1996 wasn't going to be any better. Soul Nation and Sting quickly replaced their seized equipment after the December 1995 raids and were back on the air. However, in June 1996, 4 of the area's biggest pirates were all wiped off the dial in another blitz by the DTI. Raids took place simultaneously on transmission sites for Sting FM, Soul Nation, Frontline and Love Energy after they were located by undercover vehicles equipped with tracking equipment. They seized illegal transmitters hidden in the lift housing of tower blocks in Moss Side and Old Trafford. They also took the link receivers used to pick up the signals from the studios located elsewhere. Soul Master, a DJ from Love Energy, who had been operating for 5 years and had suffered 3 raids, said his station would be back on the air soon despite the setback. Gordon Yates had retired by this time, and the regional manager was Alan Clayton. He said it was a deliberate move to target these 4 stations. Persistent offenders should be aware that they're likely to be subject to further investigations. He said pirates were interfering with vital emergency communications. I want to take you back to 1995 again briefly, as it wasn't just a tough year for the more well-known pirate stations. It was a particularly tough year for an 18-year-old called Michael Larson. He set up a studio in his bedroom and was broadcasting to listeners across Stockport, Manchester and Trafford with his station Dance Energy. He used borrowed equipment and a ghetto blaster to run his station initially for almost 2 years under the assumed radio identity DJ Chris Elliott. With his friends, he broadcast house, techno, and dance music every Tuesday night from 5 p.m. till midnight, and used a mobile phone to take as many as 100 requests a night from listeners. His parents just thought he was having his friends round to listen to music, and assumed the massive aerial, which took 6 people to fasten onto the roof, was picking up shortwave radio signals. The DTI raided his parents' home in Swan Lane, Cheadle, on the evening of Tuesday the 19th of December while his mum was ironing and his dad was in the pub. They came up to Michael's bedroom and pulled out the microphone lead and advised him to switch everything off. They took the transmitter, mixer, microphone, headphones, 2 turntables, a CD player, 31 CDs, a ghetto blaster and some tapes valued at £1,600. They tried to seize his dad's CD player, but he said he wanted it to play his new Beatles album on, so they gave it him back. The DTI men left and said they were considering prosecuting Michael. Unfortunately, they decided to make an example of Michael and took him and his friend Daniel Whitaker to court. Daniel was a DJ on Dance Energy and was also 18. Michael admitted establishing a radio station without a license, and Daniel admitted being involved in the broadcast of an unlicensed radio station. They were both fined £100 each, with £100 in costs, which I think is really harsh. To rub salt into the wound, the judge ordered all of the equipment to be destroyed. Buzz FM suffered a raid in September 1999 when Bass, aka Keith Holbrook, was raided by the DTI men as he operated from Hornchurch Court, a tower block in Hume. The station had been there for 2 years. The DTI traced the station's signal to the roof of Hornchurch Court in late 1998. The block was empty, but the officers discovered another radio link connecting the rooftop transmitter with a studio in Hume Court. This time the agency was alerted after alleged complaints regarding his nightly broadcasts on 88.1 MHz. They made a forced entry when the door wasn't answered and found Keith in a room set up as a studio. They seized records and equipment during the raids and dismantled the transmitter. He pleaded guilty to operating an unauthorised broadcast radio station on September the 13th and was given a 12-month conditional discharge and ordered to pay £150 in costs. All of the Buzz raids are covered in a separate documentary series you can find below. If you know of any more Manchester area DTI raids or were involved in any, then leave a comment below.